Some of you have seen the TV comedy The Good Place. It's a comedic look at the afterlife. In the office of the manager of The Good Place, there's a portrait of a stoner guy on the wall. We learned that this guy, Doug Forsett, was on a mushroom trip in the 1970s when suddenly he realized the actual nature of the universe. And his description was, quote, 92% correct, which has caused him great celebrity throughout the universe. Could be. It's a mystery. Our theme for December is mystery and the practice of embracing life with humility and awe. 2 Sundays ago, I considered humility and attempted to demonstrate that humbleness is a pretty wise approach to ideas, not only because it's difficult to know what we really know, but also because what we know to be true today will probably be different next week. Last Sunday, I looked at awe and how it has and hasn't worked in U.S. religious history. After all, in this country, with our attempts at separation of church and state, awe hasn't been in that awesome power or in those huge buildings. It's been personal and subjective. Remembering this is, I think, important in understanding the role of religion and the lack thereof in American life today. Last week I talked about a divergence in the conception of deity that occurred in the 19th and early 20th centuries between the traditional punishing sort of God that came with that European invasion of this hemisphere, often called the white guy in the sky, and a movement toward a nice Jesus and a loving God who wants everybody to be happy, the liberal God. I pointed out that often the difference between believing in a mighty and retributive God and a loving God has a lot to do with social location. Poverty and oppression make more sense if your view of divinity relies on a justice-dispensing, awe-inspiring God. Speaking broadly, poor and oppressed people tend toward a mighty and anthropomorphized God. The better off tend toward a more abstract God that often coincides with nature and the cosmos, sometimes to the extent that some people stop believing in God at all. I've been using the occasion of considering mystery to look back on the development of liberal religion, of which we as humanists are a part. By the way, we do well to remember that prior to the 1970s and the social chasm opened up by the Vietnam War, being a liberal in religion was mostly about open-mindedness, not politics. However, as the so-called culture wars heated up during that time, liberal religion became politically liberal as well. So let's think about that. Lists of the most important nonfiction books from the 20th century always contain a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, published in 1902 by the philosopher and psychologist William James. Things were looking bullish for liberal Christianity in 1902. At that time, the British Empire, with its Christianizing mission, was at its height. The United States, with its own Christianizing mission, was getting into the empire business and building an aspiring middle class. White supremacy and Protestant theology were on the march, and it appeared to be the wave of the future. And while William James was soaked in those assumptions, this is how he defined religion in his book. Quote, the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual persons in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider the divine. And James defined the divine as any object that is godlike, whether it be an actual concrete deity or not, which is about as broad as you can make a definition. Now, we can see why James, as a psychologist, would view religion as something going on in the minds of individuals. Meaning and purpose are subjective constructs, after all. That's also a very liberal view, and you see how liberals, especially Universalists and Unitarians at the time, would immediately pounce on that definition, since both groups had already developed a creedless tradition that valued individual conscience. In addition, many Universalists and Unitarians were convinced followers of transcendentalism. Add to this other liberal movements that were seeded by or made possible by the spread of transcendentalism, theosophy at the time, New Thought that later turned into what we call New Age, neo-paganism at the time, and the growing number of Westerners intrigued by Taoism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and you can see things were beginning to spread out quite a bit in 1902. William James was reporting and reflecting on that trend. But William James was underestimating the fact that this liberal, leftist, individualistic turn was an educated, upper middle class phenomenon. Though the quote from James in your order of service this morning shows that he actually knew his problem. If you look at the top, whatever universe a professor believes in must at any rate be a universe that lends itself to a lengthy discourse. And yes, I think UUs and humanists tend to agree. Think for a moment about where your forebears were in 1902, if you happen to know that. Were they here in the U.S.? Did they have an education? Could they speak English? Could they read English? Were they anywhere geographically close to proponents of liberal religions? Because that was occurring only in major cities. My four grandparents, for example, were young people in 1902. Two of them were completely illiterate. They were sharecroppers. Two of them could read and write a little bit. They owned a small family farm. None of those four of my grandparents could read books of theology or philosophy or even the Bible. Now, how were people like that, which describes most Americans in 1902, how were they supposed to go about understanding themselves in, quote, relation to whatever they may consider the divine? That situation continued. In the house where I grew up, a half century later, we had two books, the Sears catalog and the Bible. Now, what were people like my parents going to do with their religious impulses? One thing is for sure, they weren't going to be individualistic about it. They simply had no resources to do that. William James, liberal Protestants, and religious experimenters in general, and religious liberals down to today, often forget a very important thing about religion. Congregations educate people. Many people cannot do religion or philosophy alone. They simply don't have the education to do that. And that situation continues today. If you don't believe me, go to a Dollar General store or a Family Dollar or a Dollar Tree and find the Bibles. What you will discover is a King James translation. One reason for that is because it's out of copyright, so it's cheap, right? And it's also considered by many Protestant fundamentalists as the only true translation of Scripture. Another thing you will notice is that the print in those is so small that it is essentially unreadable. Why? It's cheap, but also because many Americans treat the Bible as a talisman. They don't read it. It's just something holy to have in the house. Now, at a 12th grade reading level, the King James Version is well above the reading level of most Americans, who the average is the 7th grade level. I suspect that it is no accident that the charismatic Pentecostal tradition exploded among the poor and the oppressed here in the United States at almost exactly the same time that William James was writing his book. The black church in its current form came out of that time period. Pentecostals, Apostolics, Church of God, Church of the Nazarene, and on and on. Nowadays, 1/4 of Americans are charismatic, and there are now something on the order of 600 million charismatic Christians on the planet, and that's in just a little bit over a century. William James and liberal religion got that wrong. At the beginning of the 20th century, the future of religion in America was theirs to lose, and they lost it. The liberal religious movement embraced individuality to the exclusion of most people in the U.S. and worldwide. This was to have profound consequences that continue to our own day. So here's a question for you. How might the liberal, ecumenical religious tradition attract the poor and the oppressed? Henry James didn't ask the question, but it is a good one. And not one is much discussed, frankly, in liberal denominations. They're wringing their hands about the potential collapse of traditions, but they aren't thinking outside of the box. As I mentioned last week, there are now more Wiccans in the United States than there are Presbyterians. In addition, I would argue that the deity most prevalent among liberal Christians today is more Hindu than Christian, and I'm going to tell you why. As many of you know, the Unitarian Universalism that we have down to us and as a tradition lists 7 principles, we do them every week, and 6 sources. And the first source of Unitarian Universalism is, quote, direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. Now, where does that source come from? Well, the 19th century writer Ralph Waldo Emerson introduced it to most people, and it spread into what we call transcendentalism. In 1836, Emerson published a long essay titled Nature. That became the Bible, if you will, of transcendentalism. And the essay starts like this, quote, our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers. It writes biographies, histories, and criticism. The foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face, we through their eyes. Why should not we also enjoy an original relation to the universe? Why should not we have a poetry and a philosophy of insight and not of tradition, and a religion by revelation to us and not the history of theirs? End quote. I should mention that he wrote the essay Nature after visiting the Museum of Natural History in Paris, by the way. Emerson was not a guy who went out walking in the woods, but he liked it anyway. Emerson is talking about awe and where we get it. The Christian tradition that was imported from Europe just won't cut it anymore, claims Emerson. Only an original relation to the universe. Now, we sang happy birthday to Beethoven a while ago, so we should remember that Emerson's idea that we call transcendentalism had been floating around in Europe for at least a generation. Back in 1798, the British poet William Wordsworth wrote this little poem, Up, up, my friend, quit your books, or surely you'll grow double. Up, up, my friend, and clear your looks. Why all this toil and trouble? Books, 'tis a dull and endless strife. Come, hear the woodland linnet. How sweet his music on my life. There's more of wisdom in it. And hark, how blithe the throstle sings. He too is no mean preacher. Come forth into the light of things. Let nature be your teacher. So, yes, Romanticism. Forget about books, forget about preachers, forget about religion. It's all about direct experience, letting nature be your teacher. Added to that insistence on direct experience was a concept the transcendentalists were learning from Hindu texts that were just beginning to trickle into the Western world because of the British occupation of India. The Transcendentalists called what had previously been called God the Oversoul, the Oversoul. Now, different Transcendentalists understood this in different ways, and I'm not sure they really grasped Hinduism all that well, but they were following Vedanta, which I need to talk about sometime. But the idea that everything is God began to seep into liberal religion. The whole shebang of the cosmos is divine. Material existence is a manifestation out of the spiritual, the cosmic consciousness, as we call the Oversoul nowadays. Now, here's how they thought it worked. When we are born, a little piece of the cosmic consciousness, the Oversoul, goes into our bodies. And when we die, that consciousness rejoins the cosmic consciousness again. And that's the afterlife. In between birth and death, the material world beats us up. Hunger, lust, greed, fear, work, all those things are there to make us forget that we are spiritual beings, that we are actually a part of the divine. This idea, of course, is the source of poet William Wordsworth's famous phrase, "The child is father to the man." The child is the father to the man because the child is wiser than older men, because the child is closer to the source, the cosmic consciousness. And so we meditate to get past those physical wants and needs and fears and all the fuss and bother of life and realize that we are manifestations of the divine. This was, by the way, in no way, shape, or form what the Christians of that day thought. This is the great separation in that idea. This idea is the source of my favorite bit of romantic verse from Percy Shelley's Meditation on the Death of John Keats. It goes like this: "The one remains, the many change and pass. Heaven's light forever shines, earth's shadows pass. Life, like a dome of many-colored glass, stains the white radiance of eternity until death tramples it to fragments. Die, if thou wouldst be with that which thou dost seek. Follow where all have fled." End quote. This is where most religiously liberal people were in 1902. Many people, oddly and paradoxically, including most liberal Protestants today, I think are somewhere in that ballpark of understanding of what the divine is. It's their mystery, and they're sticking with it. Now, the skeptics among us would say, hold up a minute, that's all very nice, but you know what we call the soul, actually that's just consciousness, and why would the universe need consciousness? Consciousness is an adaptive trait for living things, and why would the universe need any thought to survive? Actually, we skeptics say the universe is only a big explosion that we happen to be in the middle of. Furthermore, even if the universe does have a consciousness, what would lead us to believe that that consciousness even notices or likes human beings? Maybe we're just cosmic bottom feeders. Or perhaps God prefers dolphins. That's why I named my talk today, That's My Mystery, and I'm sticking with it. We don't know the answers to these questions. Liberal religion and conservative religion bifurcated, and then little offshoots like humanists came along. And it's kind of a holy mess these days. I suspect we'll never know what any of those answers are. We inheritors of a long line of liberal religious thinkers think we're right, but our ideas come with so much history and so much baggage, as do all belief systems. Mystery persists. Perhaps the ancient so-called pagans were right. Perhaps the ancient Hindus were right. Perhaps the Buddhists or the Taoists or Hebrews or Christians or Muslims, or perhaps we've already killed off the only rainforest tribe that actually had the real answer? Maybe. We don't know. Or perhaps the British writer Douglas Adams got it right in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and the answer is 42. And we just don't know how to ask the right question. It is a mystery. Now, you remember that motif if you read those books through the series is don't panic. Don't panic. And that's probably the best advice we can get about life. Don't panic. Nobody knows the deepest answers. It's a mystery. And I invite us all to be good with that.